Subaru just sent a message louder than any political headline out of Washington. In response to Donald Trump's escalating tariff regime, the Japanese automaker has begun redirecting production of Canada-bound vehicles away from Indiana and back to Japan. It is a shift no U.S. official wanted to see, a shift that signals a deeper truth. Global companies now see Canada as the stable, reliable market, and the United States as the risky one. For years, the assumption in North America was simple. If you built cars for Canada, you built them in the U.S. That era just ended.
The news broke quietly but hit the industry like a shockwave. Subaru, one of Japan's most respected automotive brands, has decided to stop relying on its American assembly lines for certain models destined for the Canadian market, choosing instead to build those units in Japan. This is a targeted shift, not a wholesale exit. Subaru still produces vehicles for American consumers in U.S. plants, but for Canada, the company has determined that sourcing directly from Japan is the safer, more predictable path. That calculation is grounded in real economic pressures. Under Trump's tariff escalations, U.S. factories face sharply higher costs when using Canadian aluminum, Canadian steel, and Canadian auto parts, all essential to modern vehicle manufacturing. At the same time, Canadian retaliatory tariffs on U.S.-assembled cars remain a real risk. By rerouting Canada-bound production to Japan, Subaru avoids this entire layer of tariff volatility. This realignment reflects exactly what major outlets such as Reuters, CBC, and Bloomberg have documented. Global manufacturers are quietly rewiring supply chains to minimize exposure to U.S. political instability.
For decades, policymakers in Washington assumed tariffs would force foreign automakers to expand production in the United States. Instead, companies like Subaru now treat the U.S. as a political variable rather than a production advantage. Economists across North America have repeatedly warned that erratic tariff swings create risk premiums that push global firms to reconsider where they build for foreign markets like Canada. The problem isn't labor, it isn't logistics, it's political volatility. A simple White House announcement can change the cost of an entire supply chain overnight. Manufacturers cannot plan multi-year production cycles on that foundation, and they won't.
In contrast, Canada presents a consistent, rules-based environment. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government has anchored Canada's industrial strategy in predictability, long-term clean tech incentives, stable trade agreements, and a diplomatic posture built on reliability. This matters for automakers who need clarity, not chaos. Reuters reported that Canada's exports to non-U.S. markets surged to record highs earlier this year, confirming that Canada's diversification strategy is measurable, not rhetorical. For a company like Subaru, that stability makes Japan to Canada production far more viable than navigating U.S. tariff uncertainty.
The irony is glaring. Trump's tariffs were designed to bring jobs back to America. Instead, they have increased the cost of U.S.-based manufacturing for international markets. Subaru moving specific Canada-bound models to Japan is not a rejection of American workers, it is a rejection of American policy volatility. When the price of Canadian steel jumps, U.S. factories suffer. When retaliatory tariffs threaten U.S.-assembled vehicles, automakers reroute production. When political unpredictability becomes the norm, companies look for safer alternatives. The result is simple. The U.S. loses production, and Canada still gets supply. This outcome illustrates a broader pattern Bloomberg has identified. Global automakers are quietly designing around the U.S., not toward it.
This story also reveals something Canadians often underestimate. Canada is a high-value auto market. With strong purchasing power and a tech-forward consumer base, Canada ranks among the most influential import markets worldwide. Multinational automakers cannot afford to lose access to it. When the U.S. becomes an unstable export base, companies don't step back from Canada, they simply adjust their supply chain to serve Canada more predictably. Subaru's move is a perfect example. Maintain U.S. production for Americans, but stabilize Canada's supply through Japan.
The implication is powerful. Canada is not a junior consumer. Canada is a market worth reorganizing manufacturing lines around. And here's what global executives understand, even if many Canadians don't. The Canadian market is unusually resilient. Vehicle demand holds steady despite interest rate cycles. Consumers are early adopters of advanced safety tech, hybrids, and electrified platforms. Provinces like Quebec and British Columbia consistently post some of the highest EV adoption rates in North America. For an automaker, this means Canada is not just a sales destination, it is a strategic test market. When companies decide where to allocate next-generation models, Canada's reliability and openness to innovation make it a priority, not an afterthought. That's why supply chains bend toward Canada when uncertainty rises elsewhere.
Subaru's adjustment also fits into Canada's broader geopolitical shift. Over the past year, Canada has strengthened industrial and trade linkages with Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and other advanced Asian economies. Carney's new Security and Defense Cooperation Partnership with South Korea and the upcoming diplomatic outreach to Japan reinforce one theme. Canada wants stable partners, and Asia's industrial giants increasingly see Canada as a dependable anchor. Japan, in particular, has expanded its investment footprint across energy, clean tech, and critical minerals, areas where Canada holds unique advantages. Subaru's decision, while limited in scale, is aligned with a wider strategic convergence between Canada and Asia's advanced industrial economies.
Subaru's decision is not a mass relocation. It's a strategic correction. But its symbolism is enormous. It reveals how global automakers separate their production lines when U.S. policy becomes unstable. It shows that Canada's importance as a standalone market is stronger than many realize. And it demonstrates that Washington's tariff-first strategy is pushing companies to design supply chains that bypass the United States when serving countries like Canada. This isn't the end of U.S. auto manufacturing, but it is a warning sign. If tariff volatility continues, more companies will make similar targeted adjustments, and Canada, with its stable policies and global partnerships, will remain the predictable destination in a turbulent world. The question now is simple. How far will this trend go, and how much leverage will Canada gain as global manufacturers continue to hedge against American unpredictability?
Mr. Speaker, they say their budget is a prop and its contents are imaginary. We're in real trouble.
In Ottawa, the political heat hit full blast this week as Prime Minister Mark Carney and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre clashed over the 2025 federal budget, a showdown that's now dominating Canada's political landscape.
Mr. Speaker, this budget is an investment budget. It's a budget for generational investment. The pace of investment is twice as quick, and this budget is going to stimulate $1 trillion worth of investment by the end of the decade. It's a growth budget for Quebec, for Canada.
Carney called it a generational investment plan designed to shield Canadians from U.S. tariffs and rebuild confidence in a shaken economy. Poilievre called it a fictional accounting and accused Carney of driving up food and housing costs through a hidden industrial carbon tax. Their fiery exchanges in the House of Commons have reignited the country's biggest debate: who really has a plan to make life affordable again?
Carney's $90 billion budget lays out a vision of infrastructure renewal, clean energy tax credits, and a national Buy Canadian procurement rule to counter the fallout from U.S. tariffs. He warned that Trump's tariff blitz is already costing Canada roughly 1.8% of GDP, about $50 billion a year. His message: we can't control what the U.S. does, but this is Canada. We can build the future we want. Highlights include a legislative fast track for the Alto high-speed rail between Toronto and Quebec City, massive clean energy credits worth billions for Quebec and Ontario manufacturers, a housing affordability plan promising 47,000 GST-reduced homes for first-time buyers. But in Parliament, Poilievre hammered Carney with sharp questions. Will the Prime Minister tell Canadians that an industrial carbon tax isn't driving up food and housing prices?
Carney shot back that the impact of the industrial carbon levy on food prices is approximately zero. He argued that the budget will stimulate $1 trillion in private sector investment by the end of the decade.
This isn't just a budget fight, it's a clash of economic philosophies. Poilievre frames the carbon tax as the root of every affordability crisis: food, housing, and energy. Carney, a former Bank of England governor, frames it as a non-factor, arguing that the real threat to affordability is the chaos coming from Washington's tariff wall. The timing matters. With President Trump's 25% tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and autos now in effect, Automa faces one of its toughest trade climates in decades. Carney's budget reads like an emergency blueprint, a mix of fiscal stimulus and industrial nationalism meant to keep Canada's economy from being collateral damage.
Poilievre has found a potent target, the housing crisis. He accuses Carney of taxing the dream of home ownership by applying industrial carbon costs to construction materials, steel, glass, and cement. Carney counters that his government is cutting GST for home builders and funding co-ops, but the optics are tough. Mortgage rates remain high and housing affordability has become the most emotional issue in the country.
Carney's insistence that tariffs, not taxes, are the real problem resonates with economists. Bloomberg notes that the U.S. tariffs could erase up to $50 billion from Canada's output. His budget's Buy Canadian clause, prioritizing domestic steel, cement, and tech suppliers, mirrors Trump's own playbook, but flips it towards self-reliance. In short, Carney is turning protectionism back on its author.
For Carney, this is the defining test of his young premiership. His technocratic style, data-driven, measured, and internationalist, contrasts sharply with Poilievre's populist fire. But while Carney talks about hope, growth, and investment, many Canadians still feel squeezed. Food bank lineups have doubled since 2019, and inflation, though easing, remains painful. If voters don't feel relief by spring 2026, Poilievre's simple message of axe the tax, build the homes could overshadow Carney's trillion-dollar ambitions. Carney's $90 billion plan also walks a fine line between stimulus and credibility. Reuters reports that about a third of this new spending will be financed through borrowing, but Carney insists it's investment, not debt. His argument, each federal dollar will attract up to 3 in private capital through green credits and infrastructure partnerships. It's a bold claim, and one that will define his credibility as an economist prime minister. If growth fails to appear by 2026, this could become his political Achilles heel. At the same time, his Buy Canadian rule marks a break from decades of free trade orthodoxy. By tying procurement for major projects like the high-speed rail between Toronto and Quebec City to domestic suppliers, Carney is effectively reshoring Canada's industrial base. It's protectionism with a purpose, to turn Trump's tariffs into a catalyst for homegrown production.
Carney's defense of the industrial carbon levy remains one of the most polarizing moments of this budget debate. Economists at the University of Guelph and RBC Economics agree the tax adds less than 1% to food inflation, yet Poilievre's narrative resonates more powerfully. His axe the tax mantra reduces complex fiscal policy into something emotional and easy to rally around. Carney's calm explanations sound factual, but in a cost of living crisis, emotion often wins over logic. Still, Carney's message that the real danger is U.S. tariff volatility, not Canada's climate policy, is slowly gaining traction among business leaders. Bloomberg described it as Canada's quiet answer to Trump's chaos. That contrast between technocratic steadiness and populist fury may shape the country's political identity heading into 2026.
This parliamentary duel also mirrors the new North American order. In Washington, Trump's tariff revival is reshaping global trade. In Ottawa, Carney is answering with fiscal activism and economic sovereignty. In Beijing and Seoul, Canada is forging new partnerships, from critical minerals to high-speed rail technology, to diversify away from U.S. dependence. In other words, this budget isn't just about dollars and cents, it's about whether Canada can stand on its own in a protectionist world.
Carney's defense of the carbon levy may win economists, but the battle for public sentiment is far from over. As question period closed, Poilievre sneered, If the tax is imaginary, then so is your budget. Carney didn't flinch. He called it a budget of hope. But hope alone won't pay for groceries or rent. The real question, can Carney's trillion-dollar investment plan deliver results before frustration turns into a political landslide?
For Carney, this is more than a fiscal test. It's a referendum on whether Canada can reinvent itself under pressure. His challenge is to prove that investment, not ideology, can restore affordability and confidence. For Poilievre, it's proof that frustration can still beat reason in modern politics. The outcome will define not just the next election, but Canada's path in an age of tariffs and turbulence.
Mr. Speaker, let me be extremely clear. We will fight for these jobs because Canadian auto workers are the best auto workers in the world. And we will make sure that Stellantis face all consequences, including legal ones.
Inside Canada's parliament, the atmosphere was electric. Questions flew across the chamber, but only one issue mattered: the future of the Brampton auto workers.
3,000 auto workers in Brampton learned that the Prime Minister had sold them out and failed them in negotiations with the United States of America. $15 billion tax dollars to the company that is moving their jobs south. So surely the government would have negotiated a jobs guarantee for every single Canadian Stellantis employee. Will they release that guarantee and the entire contract so Canadians know where their dollars went?
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre demanded answers after Stellantis announced its plan to move production from Ontario to Illinois, taking roughly 3,000 jobs south of the border. The debate was more than a political skirmish. It became a reflection of a country struggling to protect its industrial identity in a turbulent North American economy.
Mr. Speaker, of course, what Stellantis announced for the Brampton plant last week was completely unacceptable. And Stellantis has made solemn commitments to this government and to their workers, and they need to honor their commitment. An hour ago, I met here in Ottawa with the head of Canadian Stellantis, with the head of Unifor, and also with the Minister of Economic Development of Ontario. We're one strong team, Canada, and we will make sure that these jobs stay in Brampton.
While Poilievre accused the government of wasting 15 billion Canadian dollars in subsidies, Mélanie Joly stood her ground. She emphasized that Ottawa, Ontario, and the unions were united as Team Canada. Behind her calm tone was a message that resonated beyond politics. This was about defending Canada's sovereignty in the face of American economic pressure. She reminded Parliament that Stellantis had received millions in public support to retool the Brampton plant, money that came from Canadian taxpayers. The company had made clear promises to invest and build new models there. Now, with production shifting to Illinois, Joly vowed to hold Stellantis accountable under its legal and financial commitments. Her focus was not on partisan blame, but on ensuring that Canadian workers were protected. By the end of the debate, the lines were drawn. The Conservatives framed the crisis as a government failure. The Carney administration framed it as a national fight against unfair U.S. tariffs. That confrontation in Ottawa was only the surface of a much larger story, one that began long before the parliamentary shouting started.
For decades, Brampton's auto plant symbolized Canada's industrial strength. Generations of workers built vehicles there for Chrysler, Fiat, and later Stellantis. It wasn't just an assembly line, it was a source of identity, community, and middle-class stability. So when the announcement came in October 2025 that Stellantis would relocate Jeep Compass production to Illinois, it hit like a national earthquake. Across Ontario, the news spread through factory floors, union halls, and local diners. For many, it was more than the loss of 3,000 jobs. It was the erosion of something deeply Canadian, the belief that the nation could compete with the United States in manufacturing excellence. Newspapers and talk shows called it a betrayal of Canadian industry. What had seemed like a corporate decision quickly turned into a political turning point. Canada's industrial pride had been tested, and its leaders were under pressure to prove that the nation could stand on its own against the weight of Trump's economic power.
Stellantis' decision was not made in isolation. It reflected the growing pressure on global automakers caught between Trump's tariff walls and the economics of North American supply chains. The company's $13 billion U.S. investment was announced as a reshoring win, adding 5,000 jobs in Illinois. The White House celebrated it as proof that tariffs worked. Yet economists quickly pointed out a contradiction. By punishing Canada, the United States' closest trading partner, Washington disrupted the very network that made North American manufacturing competitive. The integrated auto industry depended on cross-border parts and logistics refined through decades of cooperation under the 1994 NAFTA and its successor, the USMCA. Trump's tariffs didn't just pressure foreign competitors, they fractured that network. Canadian-made engines, batteries, and electronics that once flowed easily across the border now faced delays, higher costs, and legal disputes over domestic content. The short-term result looked like a win for Trump, more jobs on U.S. soil, and a symbolic political victory heading into the 2026 USMCA review. But the long-term reality was far more uncertain. Supply chains became costlier, U.S. automakers faced retaliation from trading partners, and Canada, rather than retreating, began to transform its industrial strategy. What was meant to weaken Ottawa's leverage had the opposite effect. Canada started pushing for deeper cooperation with Mexico, expanding electric vehicle partnerships in Quebec and British Columbia, and exploring European and Asian markets to diversify exports. Trump's tariffs had triggered the very independence they were designed to suppress.
At the heart of this crisis lies something larger than trade numbers. The auto industry represents a century of Canadian industrial pride. In 2009, when Chrysler, now Stellantis, was collapsing, Ottawa stepped in with rescue funding to keep the company alive. Canadian taxpayers kept those assembly lines running. 16 years later, the same company's withdrawal felt like history in reverse. For Prime Minister Mark Carney's government, the issue was no longer just about Stellantis. It was about national credibility. If foreign corporations could take public money, break commitments, and shift jobs south under U.S. pressure, what did that mean for Canada's sovereignty? In response, Ottawa launched a coordinated plan. The federal and Ontario governments began reviewing investment contracts to ensure stronger job retention clauses. Financial support for automakers was now tied to long-term employment guarantees. Unifor, the National Auto Union, secured talks to extend worker benefits until 2027. The message was clear: Canada would not fund corporations that abandoned Canadian workers. Meanwhile, Jolie and her team intensified diplomacy in Washington, pressing for exemptions to the 25% auto tariff and for recognition of Canada's role in North America's electric vehicle supply chain. Behind closed doors, officials argued that integrated production was not a threat, but a strength for the entire continent. This moment marked a turning point. Trump's pressure campaign had forced Canada to think differently, to see industrial policy not as dependency on American demand, but as a foundation of economic sovereignty. The government's response, though defensive at first, began to evolve into something more assertive. A vision of a self-sustaining Canadian manufacturing base capable of standing beside the United States, not beneath it. In the months after the Stellantis announcement, both nations drew lessons from the fallout. The U.S. celebrated the Illinois jobs as proof that America First was working. But industry data told a different story. The Canadian Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association found that supply chain disruptions and duplicated costs had raised vehicle prices in North America by nearly 8% since the tariff wave began in 2025. In Canada, the shock turned into resolve. Investment in electric vehicle battery plants surged, with Ontario and Quebec attracting around $12 billion in new commitments by late 2025. Instead of retreating, Canadian policymakers adapted, using the crisis to rebuild industrial strength. Trump had aimed to dominate North American manufacturing through tariffs and pressure. What emerged instead was a more determined neighbor that refused to be defined by Washington's agenda. Mélanie Joly's message now echoes nationwide.
Canada's leaders and workers were shaken but united. Sovereignty is not granted by trade deals, it is earned through persistence. As the U.S. prepares for new trade talks in 2026, it faces a Canada that is stronger and unwilling to play second in the North American hierarchy. Trump's policy brought a short-term win, but it also sparked a long-term awakening. Canada's industrial pride was tested, yet it endures. From Parliament to Brampton's silent assembly lines, one conviction now defines the nation. The fight for Canadian industry is not over, and this time, Canada intends to win.
A stark new warning from the Energy Department. According to new projections, Americans could face up to 800 hours of blackouts per year by 2030. That's more than a month without power, and it's raising some questions about the reliability of our electric grid.
And residents on the Sunshine Coast say they're again sending all the power from a local dam to the U.S. for 30 years.
In British Columbia, a single proposal has turned into a national story. Powell River Energy has asked Canada's energy regulator for a license to export power to the United States for the next 30 years. That would lock in supply until 2055. But what seemed routine quickly drew heavy opposition from residents, local business groups, and the Tla'amin First Nation. For Americans, the timing is striking. Washington is counting on Canadian energy to balance out shortages created by high costs and delays in its own projects. Instead of certainty, the United States is now watching as a long-term deal stumbles at the very first hurdle. The dam in Powell River once powered a paper mill that operated for more than a century. When the mill closed in 2021, the company shifted output south. What looked like an easy export is now tangled in questions about local development and energy sovereignty. This is where a regional dispute intersects directly with the larger politics of Trump's tariff era. Donald Trump's tariff program was meant to reinforce American control over supply chains, yet the result has been the opposite in many sectors, including energy. Duties of 25% to 50% on steel and aluminum raised construction costs for utilities, while added tariffs on copper and other metals slowed investment in new transmission lines and renewable projects. The U.S. Department of Energy reported in its summer 2025 review that grid expansion targets are already falling behind schedule. Those delays have made imports from Canada more valuable. Washington assumed those imports would be secure, but the Powell River case shows the weakness in that assumption. Canada is no longer treating electricity as an unlimited export. Communities and provincial agencies are pressing to keep more power at home. Trump's trade war has therefore created an energy paradox. By pushing up the cost of domestic projects, his tariffs make America more dependent on outside supply. And at the same time, they give Canada every reason to tighten its grip on what it sells abroad. The opposition in Powell River is not symbolic. The Tla'amin First Nation and the Cranberry Business Group are redeveloping the mill site, and their pitch to investors includes reliable access to local power. Residents have organized through Energy Democracy for BC, warning that no one can predict what the region's energy needs will be in 2055. Even the provincial utility, BC Hydro, has filed for access under federal fair market rules. This fight connects to a broader trend. Ottawa has launched major nation-building projects in energy and resources, from liquefied natural gas terminals in the Atlantic to cobalt refining in Ontario. These initiatives share a common goal: to capture more of the value chain inside Canada. The longer Trump pushes tariffs across the border, the stronger the incentive for Canada to build industries that use its own resources rather than shipping them to the United States. Powell River is one community, but its debate mirrors the direction of national policy. For the White House, the implications go beyond one license application. U.S. manufacturers in border states already face higher costs for power-intensive production. If Canada restricts long-term electricity exports, those costs will climb further. Trump's strategy was designed to assert leverage, but it has created the opposite dynamic.
Canada is learning to conserve its own energy and resources, while the United States finds itself increasingly short of reliable supply. The Powell River proposal is still under review, with a new deadline for public feedback set for October 4. Yet the larger message is clear. A policy of tariffs and pressure was meant to guarantee American strength. Instead, it has encouraged Canadian communities to resist long-term deals and hold on to what they have. What began as a local dispute now stands as another example of how Trump's approach to trade and energy is backfiring, leaving the United States facing harder choices about its own security.